You can start if you'd like, and then I'll know what to say.
Sure. Okay. My name is Max Elfelt. I go to UMD. I'm in my last 2 semesters. I'm going to graduate with 2 science degrees, one in environmental science and one in biology. But yeah, I like researching theological debates and kind of getting into that kind of stuff. I'd call myself an atheist. And if you know anything about atheism, you can kind of define yourself a little bit further. And I like the way that Richard Dawkins put it. I'm an agnostic atheist in the sense that I'm not going to argue that I can prove God doesn't exist. I can say that on the scale of knowing to not knowing that God exists, I am on the scale of, I'm about here to knowing that God doesn't exist from the evidence that I've seen. So yeah, I just wanted, that point is just to say that I am not going to prove that God doesn't exist. But yeah, a lot of people really misunderstand the term agnostic and atheist. So I am an agnostic atheist. And I don't know, I think that's a really important thing to clear up. I think a lot of people misunderstand that. I don't know. That's about it for my intro.
That's cool. I think you're absolutely right with atheist agnostic. That's we'll get more into that later, but it's a easily misunderstood thing. My name's Jim, and I graduated from UMD. Got to go to school of UMax, and let's see. I graduated with a degree in psychology, minor in sociology. Now I am living down in Mankato, Minnesota. I am slowly working my way through a master's in Christian apologetics.
Cool.
So
where is that school at?
it is in North Carolina. So I'm taking the classes online.
Oh, all right.
But it's been, I don't mind it. I like online. It's, it's
Flexible.
okay, so. Huh?
It's flexible.
Yeah, it is really flexible, which is great, so.
So I guess I wrote up some questions. Do you want to jump into some of those?
Let's do those. Let's go through those, and then we'll come back and circle around atheism and agnosticism once we get the chance.
Sure. I mean, we can dive into just one question if we get going or something, but
yeah.
So the reason that me and Jim have been having a lot of conversations is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're in what people would call an old Earth creationist.
Nope, I'd be a young Earth. So there's...
from what I understand is a young Earth creationist believes the Earth is less than 6,000 years old, and an old Earth creationist believes the world is less than about 100,000.
I don't think that's completely right. There's a guy I'm talking to in one of my classes right now. I would take the fanatical 6,000 years roughly, and the reason that a young Earth person gets that is they're using the genealogies from the Bible, and then they're tying up the years to count. An old Earth creationist would be somebody who, and I want to be clear that I'm not a young Earth, I'm not an old Earth, but I don't want to throw them, under the bus. They would take the millions of years or even billions of years. So in terms of...
I was misunderstood.
The only difference between an old Earth creationist and you, and like I said, I don't want to be dogmatic about it. There are some very insightful arguments and ideas from the old Earth position. Is they would say they just don't believe in evolution from a single-celled organism to all the diversity we have, from a single-celled organism or something like it to humans that we have today.
Okay.
But otherwise, time-wise, they're in the same boat as you, my friend.
Cool. All right, and let me clear up one other thing. You take the Bible literally, or
in parts that it appears to be taken literally. Now, this is sometimes a young Earth person is we're thought of as like a flat earther. I'm not a flat earther. we're thought of as wooden-headed literalists. If the scripture seems like it's something where Jesus says in John 10:9, "I am the door." Like obviously it's metaphor. You know, there are a lot of metaphors. There are so many literary devices and genres throughout the scripture, poetry, and then there are also historical parts as well. So I would say in the parts that seem to be intended to be taken as literal, then I would say yeah, I would take it as a straightforward reading. I want to make sure that they're like not something being added to the text, because I think sometimes that happens in anything we read, where sometimes it's literal and we might not like the literal idea, so we might. And I'm not saying old Earth creationists are doing that, necessarily. But all right. So anyway, we'll
Well,
go from
okay.
there.
Well, that seems subjective to me. It seems like you're looking at the Bible and you're taking some parts literally, which I don't know. You're taking some parts literally, and then some other parts you're saying, you know, that's we shouldn't take that literally. You know, Jesus isn't a door. You know, I know what a door is. So you're kind of using your own judgment to determine what in the Bible should be taken literally and what shouldn't. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's true. It's just a basic, just like we would read something today. Any kind of reading, you look at it and you say, does this have a clear literary device, or am I adding something to this? There's different ways of doing it, like historical stuff. One of the reasons, like, okay, Luke, the gospel writer and who wrote Acts, one of the reasons we know he's writing a historical writing is because there are tons of details on, you know, governors or people in authority or locations or all these different things about the settings, where it seems like, okay, he's really striving to do a historical account. Now there is, I'd agree, there's some real subjectivity, and that's why, Max, the more you learn about Christianity, the more you see, whether it be end time stuff or creation, or I mean, there are Christians who are theistic evolutionists. There are Christians who are, there are probably maybe some out there that are flat earthers. There are all sorts of different views. But yeah, so there's a subjective component.
okay, well I guess that kind of leads into one of my other questions, and that is, do you think the Bible has any mistakes in it?
Not the original manuscripts. Copies afterwards, yes. There are some, without a doubt. So, for example, like in some texts in the Old Testament, if we look at them today, we'll see. So, for example, like First and Second Samuel. So it's that scroll is being retold. Parts of it are retold later by First and Second Chronicles. You follow? So when they do that, there are some things that they say, they're describing the same story, and all of a sudden there's a zero added to one of the numbers. And so in that case, we'd say, like, okay, well, historically, archaeologically, looking at this, we might see maybe in the manuscripts, when they're talking about this exact same thing, it would make sense for someone to have this many horses or this many stalls, but uh, not this many. So this number seems more reasonable for the time. So we would have, even in today's, like, you got 30 different Bible translations that come out every year. There's some variation, but I'd say in general, the idea is there. It's contained.
Okay, I think you were addressing like contradictions within the Bible. You know, two similar events, and they seem to contradict each other, or you know, they're not the same.
Yeah.
I guess I was trying to say that we don't have the original Bible. You know, the original books.
Yep.
So people had to translate these books, handwriting them. You know, and people make mistakes when they're transcribing or writing from one to the other, and then you know the books get passed down generation after generation after generation, and then it's translated to different languages. It's weeded out by church hierarchies, and it's like a comedian put it as the Bible is the world's biggest game of telephone, and I think that it is.
Uh-huh.
And I think that if you try to take the Bible literally, you are taking all these mistakes in, and there's no way of double checking. You know, there's no original text. The Bible is dynamic throughout time,
Yep.
So
Great. I'm so glad you brought this up, Max. This is like totally different than what I was expecting. I mean, by that I mean I was the reason I was so cautious, the reason I was wondering what your questions were ahead of time was I was thinking there were going to be really technical journals that I didn't understand on young Earth stuff. And so I was really like, I was like, well, Max, what are these questions? But this is a really good question. This is actually a really good one. So this is what I would say is throughout ancient history, we can see, we take a guess roughly when documents are written, right? And so then we say, do we have the originals? Now, as far as I know, out of all ancient works, we don't have any originals. So that, whether it be Plato, Aristotle, or Roman historians like Tacitus or Josephus, the Jewish historian, now Tacitus was a little bit after Jesus. Josephus lived in the same century as Jesus. The idea is, though, none of these ancient works have the originals. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the Bible follows to be legit. You know what I mean? It may be that they're all inaccurate. But here's what I would say is, between when the originals were written and when we have the earliest manuscripts, manuscripts just being a copy, we have the shortest distance between the writing and the first manuscript after, compared to any other ancient writing with the New Testament. So for the New Testament, we have a scrap of John, for example, that comes to within 30 years of when John was probably written, because most mainstream historians would say that John, the Gospel, was written in 95 AD. So now we have earlier manuscripts, or not earlier than that, we have manuscripts later of like the whole Bible that are from, I think the fullest ones we have are definitely more than 100 years after. I think it was 250 or 350, somewhere in between there is we have our first full Bible. But here's the trick, is even with that, we are still miles ahead of any other ancient work. So for example, the runner-up after the Bible, or when I say the Bible, I mean the New Testament, the runner-up is actually Homer's Iliad, with 500 years between when it was originally written and the first manuscript. So even with a full Bible, we're significantly ahead. But here's the other thing too, is we have so many manuscripts. For the number of manuscripts, the more you have, the better, Max. So for example, if I were to try to take Time magazine, and I'll try to wrap this up real quick because I'm taking a lot of time, but let's say this month I said, hey, I want to find all the issues of Time magazine and I want to change them so it says that Jimmy Coons is president, not President Obama. Now here's what I would have to do. I'd have to track down millions of copies, right? It would be almost impossible to do this. Even as the president, this would be so hard to do. But now let's say they only printed like 100 this month. It would be hard to do that, but not nearly as hard as finding 5,000. So the more manuscripts you have, the better. Because then, not only if you have a mistake, you can look at all the other manuscripts to compare what they say where that mistake is, but it also makes it harder for a power to gather the manuscripts and corrupt them. So for the New Testament, we have, now this is another thing too, is compared to all ancient writings, the New Testament has more manuscripts than any other writing. So New Testament has 5,686. That's just in Greek. So compared to the next runner-up, which is Homer's Iliad with 643. Now Plato, I think, has 7. Aristotle has, I think it's 10 for Aristotle. I mean, Tacitus, a Roman historian from roughly around the same time as Jesus, there are 20 manuscripts. So I mean, historians would say, yeah, we don't have a ton of manuscripts, but we can still use a lot from here and learn a lot from this. And that's why the New Testament is so, and this is the last thing I'll say, we have so many manuscripts that we have a 99.5% accuracy. This is from Bruce Metzger, so which is like a very distinguished New Testament historian. He would say 99.5% accuracy between what we have today, like what I have sitting next to me, compared to the earliest manuscripts that we have. So if anything were to worry you, this is good. It's a reasonable thing to think about, but that would be, it wouldn't be the first thing that I would object to Christianity about.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of my point. Just that if you're going to take the Bible literally, you have to accept that there's probably some mistakes in it.
Yeah, I think here's the one thing though is I would grant that some of the manuscripts, we see that manuscripts have mistakes, but like I said, when you have such an abundance of manuscripts, you can look at these 5 that have a mistake, and then you can compare it to the other 5,000, and you can put together pretty well which one is right.
Well, I guess the quantity of manuscripts doesn't really reflect the accuracy of them. It's the change of the manuscripts over time that would reflect the accuracy of them. So really, quoting large quantities of them really doesn't validate them being accurate. There could be tons and tons of them, all with the same mistake in them.
Yeah, good point. But here's the thing, though, is you can always say could have happened, but unless we have the evidence that there are mistakes in the manuscripts that give us a way higher percent uncertainty than the 0.5% uncertainty that we have, unless we had the evidence for that, we can't just assert that therefore there are mistakes. The idea is that from the manuscripts we have, the 5,686, just in Greek, we look at those and we say we have a 99.5% accuracy because we're using the methods like I explained. Like, if you find an error in this many, you look at the rest of them and you say, well, what are they trying to communicate? What makes sense here in the cultural context, all that. So I know there's not 100% certainty. That's why I wouldn't use this as an argument for Christianity. There's not a 100% certainty that like I said, you can see in Bibles today, there may be a contradiction between Chronicles and Samuel between 2 different numbers, but I mean, it's a pretty minor detail considering the idea of the salvation of how a person comes to know God or goes to heaven. So,
all right. Well, if you wouldn't mind, I have a science question for you.
That's fine, as long as as long as it's not too technical.
No.
Just break it down for me.
Okay, so I asked you about evolution.
Yep.
And you said that I believe in evolution to the extent of speciation.
Yep.
Right? So you do believe in, or you accept speciation as fact. That is, one animal changing over time in a population to where it can't breed with one of its original, cousins.
Yes, for example,
yeah, it was a bad explanation.
I get you. That's cool. Like, for example, like rabbits from Minnesota, if they migrate to Florida and Alaska, eventually those rabbits are not gonna, from Alaska and Florida, they're not gonna be able to interbreed. And so in that sense, you could say there's a new species.
Well, no, you're starting with like a population of all similar rabbits, and then these rabbits are changing, and maybe a landform cuts the population into a big mountain range, So these rabbits over here, they are adapting to that environment. These rabbits over here are adapting, but they're still, from the same population a long time ago. Over a long period of time, those 2 populations of rabbits are going to change to where they cannot go back together and interbreed.
Agreed, yeah.
That's speciation.
Yep.
So in all practical sense, speciation is evolution in my mind. So if you could explain how speciation doesn't fit evolution.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, Max. You're right, it does. This is what I would say is it fits evolution and it also fits a creation framework. Because for a young earther like me, we would say, yeah, there's variation within a kind. Like we see, speciation happen. And so it would work with both.
So I guess, do you believe in evolution?
I believe that I believe, for example, and obviously natural selection, we observe natural selection. Mutations, I believe in mutations. Genetic drift and sexual selection. So all these different modes that I hear of, absolutely, if they're observable, which those all seem to be, I would say yeah. But I would say I don't believe that we can go, I think there are genetic limits where I don't think we can go from a single-celled organism to you and me. You know what I mean?
Well, that's a pretty big jump, and there was a recent study, I didn't mean to cite it, but there was a recent study that showed a single-cell organism that could form a multicellular organism. They did it in a laboratory. But I mean, you're just asking this huge question of one single cell to humans. Make the link, and in my eyes, you do believe in evolution because you believe in speciation, and speciation occurring over and over and over and over again over millions of years produces a huge, diverse array of life that can evolve further into more complex organisms.
Yeah, well, here's where I would differ though. Is like a lot of times people would say, Jim, of course, evolution's a fact, and they would say, and by that they're referring to evolution as humans and everything else on Earth evolving from single-celled organisms, and maybe not the exact same single-celled organism, but back to the beginning of life. Um, and they'd say, so I mean, look around, Jim. We see evolution. You see natural selection. So obviously it's a fact, and that's where I would say, well, there's two different definitions we're giving evolution in that case. We're kind of, and it's kind of like it's called equivocation, where there's a different concept between everything coming from single-celled organisms versus, rabbits not being able to breed anymore. So I would say, yeah, we see speciation, we see this evolution with limits. Some people call it microevolution, but I wouldn't agree with what you might call macro, the idea that everything came from a single-celled organism.
Well, microevolution and macroevolution are terms made up by creationists to just diverse the issue even further.
Well, actually, I wouldn't agree with that, because I just read the other day. I think macroevolution, I think it's like biology101.org or something. It says that, and this is not a big point. It's not like but evolutionary scientists, I think they do use those terms, but they use them differently than young Earth people do. That's why I was like, I don't like, but it's the only thing I can think of calling micro and macro. But I mean, I think they use it for a different thing than what young Earth creation people typically use it for. And some people don't say microevolution; they say variation of the kind. But no, that's just the idea of two different concepts. I'll send you that link where it says that if you want, I can send it right now, where it says that evolutionary scientists would use the term, but it's just creation scientists use a different meaning behind it.
Okay, I guess I just don't see where you put the limits on, you can have genetic diversity and new species forming and more diverse forms of life forming, but there's some sort of limit,
Mm-hmm.
What's the limit?
Yeah, good point. Well, this is what I would say is, I'd say the limits are, roughly speaking, what we see today, where we see, people will bring up the peppered moth. Like, yeah, we see the colors of moths changing. Like, we see, even, like, I think there was I read in a book not too long ago, it's called Refuting Evolution. I think it was Sarfati was his last name. And he talked about how there's even species that'll come about, a new species within 100 years. Like, I would believe in that. That's cool. But I would differ in the idea that you could get, our trillion-celled bodies with such complexity from a single-celled organism. I mean, the burden of proof here would be on you. It wouldn't be on me to disprove that that's impossible. It would be for you to show that it happened.
I guess it's hard for people to understand the large timescales involved in evolution. But we do see, when you go through the fossil record, as you go down through the fossils, we have the most complex organisms found at the closest to the surface. And as we go down deeper into the older layers of rock, we see more simplified organisms. And the most simple organisms we see in the oldest rocks are archaea and bacteria. And just by looking through the ages of the rock, you can see that slow transformation of more and more complex organisms over literally billions of years. I mean, I can't even wrap my mind around a billion years. 1,000,000,000 years? I can't even think of what a million years is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's incredibly hard to wrap your mind around. But if you look at the geological record, it's a pretty nice way to understand the complexity.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, this is the first thing I'd have to ask is what is the definition of complex? Because you said we see more complex things here than we do back long ago on the fossil record.
I guess you brought up complexity in our cells.
Oh yeah, I know. Okay.
Humans are obviously complex. So
Yeah.
what's simple? A bacteria. As you get more and more complex from a bacteria, they start having internal organs. They start being able to they have to feed themselves. They're not autotrophs. They have obviously we have a conscious now. We're conscious beings. I guess we don't really know what other beings are conscious. I would guess that there are many more other than just humans. But I mean, a complex is all relative. I mean,
well, okay. Well, using the definition I was thinking of when I said complex, like I meant, and I would see what you're saying, where bacteria would seem much simpler, because I was thinking complex as in we have, the 12 different systems, like the digestive, the reproductive, all that. I was thinking of that being the complexity example of how humans are much more complex. This is what I would say, as far as I've read. Now, bacteria, like you and I would agree, bacteria has existed since, you said like it's been the earliest thing there ever was. Well, not necessarily the earliest, but you know what I mean? Like it goes back to some of the oldest rocks, right?
Yep.
Okay, so my idea is I'd say that agreed it does, and I would say the first organisms we have are, I don't think there's, for one thing, between like the bacteria and the Cambrian explosion, I don't see the transition there. That's why it's called the Cambrian explosion. Like you see some complex organisms just almost appear without any transition, and that's where I would say we're seeing things that have been buried. So, for example, like trilobites that might get washed in mudslides from the flood, and everything that's in the water would be buried, whether it be starfish or other crustaceans. They would be buried because all that crap goes into the water and covers it.
Okay, so I guess were you trying to say like the Cambrian explosion is we all of a sudden see this huge amount of biological diversity and relative complexity? Is that your point, or?
Yeah, the Cambrian explosion. I'd say the Cambrian explosion, as far as I've read and found, is that there's not a lot of transition between earlier on organisms versus boom, all of a sudden we have this explosion of unique.
Yeah, you're totally right, and that is a kind of a knowledge gap in science right now, and it's a really interesting field to study. But yeah, you're right. There is a hole in the knowledge of that huge explosion of biodiversity, and I guess you can't really make an argument out of a lack of knowledge. It's just it's easy to say. What you should say is, we don't know. We can't make conclusions from a lack of evidence.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. My argument was never gaps in the fossil record, therefore creation. I was still, remember the original question before, I was asking you, the burden of proof is on you for the transition, and I just don't think we see that, because we're talking about evolution right now. Like, I'll give you evidence for young Earth if you want. That's not what I was talking about right now. I was asking you, like, are we sure we see this transition? Because obviously the fossil record is not everything, not a lot gets fossilized, but it looks like there's some pretty important gaps where can we at least question evolution, like that it happened?
Okay. Well, I guess, do you want to move on? I think I've got a couple more questions. Maybe like a theological one?
Sure. Is it okay if I just go back to really quick, we'll jump to yours. I just wanted to talk about atheism and agnosticism first.
Yeah, go for it.
You were right that this was not going to work in a half hour. Here's what I would say: is I can't prove to you that Christianity is true, um, and so I would say, but at the same time, I'm not an agnostic, right? Like, even if a person, let's say they were like, I'm not a, a hardcore, I can prove it theist, but they said, but I lean toward theism. If they were to say that, we would say, well, what good reason do you have for believing in that? Because to diverge from agnosticism, which is right there on the fence, usually we have to have a good reason for going toward theism or toward atheism. Because, like, usually, like you already mentioned, and I'm glad that you understand it well, is that really common for some people today to think that atheist means just a lack of belief in God. But if you look it up traditionally in philosophy and today in the most recent published Oxford Dictionary, atheist meant you deny the existence of God. So, but if you were going to affirm or deny, we'd have to have an argument for that. I mean, what good reason do you have for, rather than being straight up on the fence, what good reason do you have for leaning toward atheism?
Yeah, I guess I might not follow that dictionary definition. I would put myself as saying that the evidence available points toward the lack of there being a God.
But that would be similar to an atheist. You're making the negative statement that God probably doesn't exist.
Yeah, for all practical senses, he doesn't exist.
But I mean,
or she.
Like if I were to say I lean towards the idea that God does exist, people would say, well, why not be an agnostic? What good reason do you have for leaning towards the idea that you think God exists? I'm saying, like, if you're going to lean toward atheism, what good reason do you have?
To start, the great diversity in religions, and they're all claiming that they have the correct answer and all of the other ones are wrong, and that the distribution of religion across the world is set so that they found that the biggest determining factor in someone's religion is where they grew up, i.e., their parents' religion. So if I grew up in India, I'd probably be a Hindu. If I grew up in Pakistan, I'd probably be a Muslim.
Good point. Yeah. With that though. I mean, are you sure that you think just because there's a diversity in the belief of God that I don't see how it logically follows that therefore there's probably not a God? I could see how it would follow that people might be confused or misled about what God is like, but logically, how does it follow? And well, I'll jump to the next one. But like whether or not people learn something from their parents, to say that something's not likely to be true based on its origin rather than its own logical validity would be the genetic fallacy. I mean, just to say, well, that came from their parents, that's the number one predictor of someone's religion, that has nothing to do with the truth value of the claim. Cause
it doesn't, no. I totally agree with you there.
What about the first part, though? Like, if there's I mean, for example, you probably believe in. I don't want to get into the. We don't have to get into the objective, the moral argument that I was talking about in our discussion. But do you believe there are moral? I know you believe there are moral values, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are some. But
yeah.
But I mean, Max, if you think about it, you could use the same reasoning and say there are different cultures that have different beliefs on morality. Just because there's diversity in the belief on morality, like there's diversity in the belief on God, it wouldn't follow that therefore there are no moral values, right?
I don't know, maybe say that again. I'd kind of...
Okay, so I was using it as an analogy with, so for example, with God, we wouldn't say that because there's a diversity of beliefs on God, like to say that therefore it's probably not true that God exists. Wouldn't that be kind of akin to saying there are a lot of different views on morality, therefore there aren't any real moral values? Like,
no, I think that God is just an idea, and morals are more rigid. They're actually, I don't know, God is an imaginary friend, and morals are an idea of how to live your life the most right way. And it's pretty, and that was just one of my objections to theism.
Hold on,
is the geographic distribution.
Can we just go? Can we keep going with this one though? Because
yeah.
But my only point was just the principle to say that God probably doesn't exist because people have different ideas on God. I mean, wouldn't it seem with morality if you were to say, well, therefore moral values don't exist because different people have different ideas on moral values? Like, it just doesn't seem to me to logically follow that. I mean, with morality, we wouldn't say moral values don't exist because different people have different ideas on moral values. So why is it with God we would say, well, different people have different ideas on God, therefore God probably doesn't exist? How does that logically follow?
Because morality is completely different than a God. A God is a completely different idea than morality. So if you're comparing the two, it's not gonna work.
Okay, but even if it's a poor analogy, you haven't explained the reasoning how just because different people have different ideas of God, how does that make it? I mean, like I said, I can understand how that makes it seem that they might be misled about God or confused about God, but I don't see how would that be an argument that then there's probably not a God because they have different views of God.
Because everyone comes to the same conclusion. No, let me take that back. So religion A says, my God is true. He has X, Y, and Z characteristics. Religion 2 says, my God has A, B, and F characteristics. And this is the true religion, and all other religions are wrong. And religion B says, this is the true religion, and all others are wrong. And then religion C comes along with the same thing. Religion 4 comes along, they're the true religion, and all the others are wrong. And I believe it's called Occam's razor. I don't know if it applies here, but everyone is coming to this same conclusion, and the best solution, or the best reasoning to that, the best reasoning to that is to say that they're all wrong. Maybe they're all wrong. I don't know.
Okay, so it's not really the fact that there's, because I mean, you could, even if there was, so diversity is now kind of irrelevant. Because I mean, even if there was no diversity, let's say everybody had the exact same belief on God, you could still use Occam's razor and say, well, it's easier if we just cut God out. Let's just go with that. I mean, are you kind of changing it to where you're just saying, well, no, it's not really about the diversity, it's more about Occam's razor?
Well, the diversity is relevant. To describe it, but the diversity is important. I don't know. I guess I'm kind of running out of steam on that one.
Well, we can go to a different one if you want. I just don't know. If you want, we can go to a different one. I'm not sure if I see how it follows.
I mean, I have some other questions too.
Okay.
So how about this one? Is defining faith as a belief without evidence, is faith a good thing? Or maybe you have a different definition of faith.
I think there's different kinds of faith. You could have maybe a blind faith, which is completely not based on evidence. In the circumstance that it's used, that could pay off, and maybe it couldn't. So, for example, if I trusted, let's say my car was broken down, and I was like, "Hey Max, I need you to give me $30 to get back somewhere," and you said, "Okay." And let's say I didn't know you, so I had no idea whether you're trustworthy, and you gave me $30, and you said, "But give me your credit card, and once you mail me the money back, I'll give you the credit card back." Now, my blind faith might lead me to say, okay, and then let's say you were a good guy and you sent me back the credit card after I paid you back. You know what I mean? Oh, let's say I lived in a faraway place. I'm sorry, this is a hard analogy. But, so, the idea is, sometimes when you have blind faith in certain circumstances, it can just happen to pay off because you trusted somebody. For example, I trusted that after I mailed you that $30, you would send me the credit card. And let's say you send me the credit card back, then that blind faith would be okay. If you didn't, then it was, oops, that was not a good idea to have blind faith. But there are also good reasons to have faith if it's based on evidence. Now, that's the thing is, for example, if we have evidence for God, we may not be able to prove God, but we may use faith to fill in the gaps of our worldview. So if I have good arguments for the existence of God, I might not understand everything about him, and that based on the evidence, I believe because of the evidence. Kind of like you. So do you understand what I'm saying? Like,
well, maybe it would be easier with a more realistic analogy. Say, I have faith that the Pope, everything the Pope says is right, and it's morally to a T what the Bible says, and he's talking through the Word of God. So I have this faith that whatever the Pope says is correct, and that's how I should live my life. Do you think that's a good thing?
well, I'm not Catholic, so no. If I would say it would depend on what you're putting your faith into. Just like with people, like I might trust you to pay me that money back, and then in some events it might not be a good idea to trust some people. So in terms of the Pope, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Frankly, I think the idea is it's unbiblical. Like the idea, I think it's called the papacy of the Pope. I don't know, but the idea is that the Pope's infallible. I don't believe that. But I mean, so are you talking about the practical kind of benefits behind an idea?
No, I'm just trying to get at faith and what is is it valuable to put all your chips into a certain idea or a certain belief?
Again, I would say it depends on the belief and how much evidence there is for it.
Cool.
Because some are definitely bad. I'll be the first to concede there are false religions that have led people to do horrible, horrible, evil things.
Yeah.
Religion has caused evil.
How about one more science question? I don't know if you're.
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
Okay. So, contrary to evolution, do you have some sort of other belief that we could go at to understand biology, whether that's intelligent design or creationism?
Good question. I haven't studied a lot of intelligent design. I haven't read one book on it, and frankly, I haven't read much on it. So I can't say. There was one idea I heard of it, irreducible complexity. I still have questions on it, but I just haven't been super swayed by it. Like, not to say that it's not possibly true, or, a good scientific find, but because so when I brought that up to somebody, they said, well, there's a good answer for that, and I don't remember what he said, and that's why I'm still not sure. But you're talking about kind of a model.
Well, right now, how do we assess what is truth in the natural environment? And that, to me, is science.
Yes, I think science is a great thing.
And I was just curious if since you took a kind of a alternative position to accepting evolution, that if you had some alternative to evolution that might help us better understand biology and maybe provide some practical application like evolution does today.
I think evolution does today in the sense of microevolution, but I don't think the idea that... So, for example, when we work on different kinds of medicines, we can look at principles of natural selection or mutation, and we can probably learn a lot to make good medicine. But those are things that are still within a creation worldview. So, you're thinking of a larger model? Is that what you're asking for? Rather than the giant evolutionary theory, you're saying what other model do we have in place of it?
Yeah. So you right now you're kind of denying evolution to some point, but do you have a different scientific explanation for what we see in evolution?
So let's see. By
And
what?
I figured you'd say something like intelligent design.
Like I'm not, like I said, I don't want to say that intelligent design. Like I believe in intelligent design because I believe there's an intelligent designer. In the theory itself, I haven't read much about it, so I don't know yet. But
Okay.
I would say, let's see.
Well, how about another quick one?
Well, hold on. I'll just say that I think that the principles of natural selection and mutation should be taught in school. Frankly, I'm okay with evolution being taught in school. I'm talking about large scale evolution, but I think that we should also teach different evidences. For example, for young Earth, like we've talked about, I think polystrate fossils. I think those are a good evidence for young Earth.
Okay.
And I know you don't agree with that, but I mean that's another convo. I would say, in terms of a model, that's a good question. I think the model of saying, hey, for sure, natural selection and mutation, that happens. Let's build off of that and go from there.
Okay. So do you think that? I'm guessing you don't think humans evolved from simpler beings, correct?
If you're saying simpler, as in,
A primitive.
so maybe like Lucy.
Ape, yeah, an ape-like being.
No, I don't believe that.
Okay. So do you have anything to say about vestigial organs in us as well as other animals, which would hint toward a macroevolution? Like I'll give you a couple examples. Humans, they have goosebumps, and there's like a specific muscle that produces goosebumps, and human hair really doesn't serve any purpose. But if we were furry animals, that like goosebumps would raise our fur up, would keep us warm, and make us look bigger to different animals. Human tailbones, male nipples, and like snake and whale leg bones. You can find remnants of leg bones in snakes and whales.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. For Goosebumps, I haven't read anything about it, so I don't know if it's. But I'm not sure if. Well, this is what I think I know about it, is that Goosebumps do serve a purpose, though, in that when you have Goosebumps, it squeezes your skin together so you keep heat in, right?
I think just kind of off the top of my head, I would think that if your skin was producing bumps, it would increase the surface area of your skin and thereby make you cooler by more evapotranspiration. But I don't know.
I wish I could take a bed sheet or something and look at it right now. Because I don't know. You could be right. If it did increase surface area, then you'd be losing more heat. That's what I had thought that they served. Like that's what I had thought they were for. But humans having goosebumps, I don't know. I could see that as. Oh, you're saying because it would make sense if we used to have hair and therefore it'd make us look bigger, right?
And keep us warmer by making us an air pocket. So furry animals do this today.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. That's one thing I don't have an answer to, other than if they. I think this is what I was under the impression, is they keep you warm even if you don't have matted hair. So, for example, my arm is not like a dog's leg. But I was still under the impression it would still keep you warmer. I could be wrong about that. In which case I don't have an answer for it right now.
I think vestigial organs point to macroevolution, but also point to, at least in the case of the human body, an unintelligent designer. Because why do I have nipples? Why did God give me nipples?
Yeah.
They don't do anything.
Well, for these other cases, I think I do have some explanation. For example, with the tailbone, there are actually 9 different muscles that attach to the tailbone. So it's actually a lot more important than you'd think, and it also helps support the colon, as far as I've found or read or heard. So, now if it didn't do those things, then I would say it looks like it's useless. But, and I'll get to your second part about poor design in a second. But
sure.
I think you mentioned snakes.
Snakes and whales.
Snakes. I think there is a purpose though for those what looks like they used to be what looks like vestigial legs. Is that it helps them climb while they're mating, like it helps them move around on each other while they're mating. And
Okay.
whales, I think it's the same thing, not in the sense of climbing around on something, but I think those are necessary for either something to do with giving birth. This is something from a long time ago, and I'd
Okay.
have to look it up. But I think there is something for whales, for example, like giving birth, or maybe it's either mating or carrying or giving birth. But the last one, and I'll let you go back and respond to these because. But the last thing, male nipples, as far as I've read, male nipples occur on the human body before we even know if it's a male or female. So um, I would say I don't think that necessarily means it's vestigial. It just means that, I mean, so are you trying to say that male, when we used to be something like Lucy, that we used to give milk, that men used to milk, or male organisms used to produce milk for their babies?
No, I'm not saying they're vestigial. I'm saying they're useless.
Oh, okay. So kind of like the idea of like, well, this looks like a poor design.
Yeah.
Well, this is
Same with like the esophagus. I mean, I breathe and eat through the same hole, so I can choke. Why didn't God give me an eating hole and a breathing hole?
good question. This is what I would say is, for one thing, for us to know that it's a poor design, we would have to know the intention of the designer. And so, when thinking about that, when we can't know fully, now we can know things about God, but I don't. It's literally, it just doesn't make sense for a finite mind to grasp an infinite mind. I don't know if we know the full purpose of the creator for why he created things the way they were. So I don't know how solid that would be as an objection against. But I think the second thing would be that even if you granted, like, even if I granted, like, this is poor design, like, obviously, you know you don't mean it when you say design, but using the idea of looks like poor design, if you were to find, like, let's say you were on a lake and you found a boat that looked like it was really crappy, like, you know, nobody even built in like a seat, the sail was just horribly awkward, and the boat just looked horrible for going through the ocean or through a lake. It would be poor design, but we'd still think it was probably designed. Now, I know you have an explanation for that, which is you'd say, well, we got that through evolution, buddy, that's why. But I would say, without knowing the actual purpose of, we couldn't know if it was an actual bad design.
So, do you think there's a possibility that the purpose of my mouth, that there's something more? There's more than just breathing and eating. There's more purpose to my esophagus.
That's the thing, is I would say I couldn't know that. Like, not knowing the actual purpose of God in his design and how he created things, it's hard for me to say that this couldn't possibly be a good design for what God had in mind.
So maybe God put like a secret switch that he can turn on, so that when he turns that switch on, then you'll never have to worry about choking on food.
That sounds like heaven, but in terms of here and now, no, I couldn't know what the purpose was for the design. That's my point, we couldn't call it a bad design, Max, unless we knew the purpose. So, for example, let's say we found that boat and we thought, this looks horrible, but then they said, well, we weren't really going to use it for going on the lake, we're using it for this different purpose. Now, we might not know what that is, but in that case, if they had an alternate purpose, we might say, like, oh, well, I guess in that case, we didn't know what it was designed for, so for what you actually designed it for, it might have been useful.
Well, I think for all practical purposes, we can determine what the purpose is for our biological organs in our body. I mean, in science, we figured out a lot of this. The purpose for the ear, the purpose for the eye, and I think, you're just kind of like undercutting it and saying, well, it might have some other greater purpose that we can't possibly understand.
Yeah, well, here's what I would say is, I'm not trying to make an argument. I'm not trying to use this as an argument for God. Like, I haven't used the argument of design. I'm only trying to neutralize the idea that God couldn't possibly have any reason for designing things the way he did. I'm saying without us actually knowing God's particular purposes and what he had in mind, we can't know for sure that this is for sure a bad design and that he screwed up. So that's all I'm saying.
All right, that's fair enough.
Although I think there are good arguments from design, for example, in the universe, like a life-sustaining universe. So I think there are good arguments out there. But in terms of the jaw, I've never used that as an argument or stuff like that.
All right. Well, do you want to wrap this thing up? I'll give you the last word, maybe. I don't know. I don't think anybody's going to want to watch a over an hour long video.
You're right.
So.
Well, I would say here's some of the evidences. Now, all the things that I can show you because we never really talked about my positive case for Christianity.
Yeah,
and that's
episode 2.
Yeah, maybe you're right. What I would just say is, like, I think there are good reasons to believe. And so, for example, with Young Earth, we still have to mull this out, or mull this over between you and I, like polystrate fossils, or finding detectable amounts of carbon-14 and things that allegedly, from my point of view, should not have carbon-14. Stuff like that. Christianity, I'd say more bigger, because an old Earth creationist would tell me, they'd probably say, well, Jim, like, I believe in millions of years. So they'd say it's not even relevant to Christianity. They'd say, hey, maybe they'll use different arguments from science, but one thing we definitely agree that is really relevant and important is that there's historical evidence for the resurrection. So if I could just lay out 4 historical facts really quick that just are well supported, and that the majority of it's not just me that believes in this. The majority of historians would say, like, yeah, these are well supported, and I believe these individual facts. Not all of them are Christians. Not all of them believe in God, but they would say, for example, 1, Jesus Christ died by crucifixion. In all of ancient history, this is an extremely supported fact. 2, that the disciples sincerely believed to the point of death or persecution that Christ appeared to them. 3, that James and Paul, who were both opponents of Christianity, both believed that Christ rose and appeared to them. And then the last fact, that the tomb that Jesus was buried in was empty after 3 days. Now, taken together, none of these ideas are miraculous. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't say that. The fact number 2 was not that the disciples saw Jesus Christ resurrected. It's that they sincerely believed to the point of death or persecution. But looking at this is just an inductive argument where we would say the best explanation for these facts is the resurrection. Now, there's objections, and like, if you want to voice them, that's cool, but I know we don't have a lot of time, so people might say, what about the apparent death theory? He didn't really die. What about hallucinations on behalf of the disciples? Like, that's something we could talk about. Like, that's fun stuff to talk about. And then even more so, my faith would be based on philosophical arguments that, for example, we can't account for laws of logic outside of the Christian worldview. In other words, that they're justified by the Christian worldview. And that since no other worldview can account for them, and that we know that they are, I mean, nobody denies laws of logic. To deny logic, you have to use logic. So, since we know they're there, we would say Christianity true, because we can show every other worldview is defective in accounting for them. Now, that takes a long time, but so I just wanted to get out that I'm not just believing it because I don't believe in other views. It's because I think there's positive evidence for Christianity.
Well, it sounds like episode 2 is going to be all about positive arguments for Christianity.
That would be really good. Thank you so much. This has actually been just really very nice.